Okay. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. I love having this in between me and I need this in between me and my students when I hand back papers. They're usually quite polite about it, actually. Thank you for being here. This is the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I'll start with a personal story of how I got interested in this topic. When I was growing up in Baltimore, it was the early 80s, and every night on the news there was something about fear of nuclear war and Cold War. And I remember asking my mother, it's probably about 1983, I asked her, Mom, it was probably about 6, Mom, would the Russians bomb Baltimore? I guess I was scared. And she said, oh, no, honey, they wouldn't bomb Baltimore. And I was relieved. And then she said, but they would bomb Washington and we'd get killed from the radiation. So I guess I was just destined to study this topic. But it's been 80 years. I was just thinking that 1945, the bomb used for the first time, 80 years before that was the end of the Civil War. It was almost, just a few months after Appomattox. And that's just insane to me, the distance between then and now. I mean, I study this, so it's very real to me, but of course the people involved in this, it would have been the same distance back to the Civil War. And I just, the technology that has been achieved. They did all this without a smartphone, right? That's sort of something I keep reminding myself. But I do want to explain that, so much attention is paid to the Manhattan Project and the making of the atomic bomb and the use of it. I'm going to talk a little bit today about, the lifetime after it was born. So it's 80 years old today. It's about the age of my parents, I suppose. And so I'll look over the years about how it's evolved, how the public has reacted to it, and certainly if you have any comments or questions, just feel free to chime in. I felt this would be pretty casual. And I'll talk about my slides a little bit, but they're mainly for illustrative purposes, just to give you something to look at besides just me. In 1945, of course, the bomb was born, and this actually is not the bomb, but this is the test site of the first atomic bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico. This was, I think, a device that they thought might be used to hold the bomb at some point. I don't think it was used, but you can see the kind of desert environment where it was first tested. The Trinity site, as it was named. The troops for the Trinity site, I feel we should recognize, won the award for the lowest venereal disease rate in the Army during World War II. I didn't know they gave awards for that. But the point is that it was desolate. There was not much around it for miles and miles. Scattered ranches and such. And you can see here the actual bomb that they tested on July 16th, 1945. The countdown began at 5:09 and 45 seconds in the morning with a 20-minute countdown. There were observation sites set up at 5 miles away, 20 miles away, and one of the physicists involved passed around a large amount of suntan lotion, I guess thinking that would help. They didn't know what was going to happen. And if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you get a good sense of this. There was a warning rocket at 1 minute, and the head scientist, Robert Oppenheimer, apparently said, "Lord, these affairs are hard on the heart." And then the bomb went off. The pictures are, not great, but they're still telling in their, I think, in their visual nature. The bomb exploded at 18.6 kilotons, so that's 18,500 tons of dynamite, a 300-foot crater, and the ground 2,400 feet around the tower fused into glass. Here you can see just an overhead sight of it, or an overhead view of it. With these weapons, the scale, you lose the sense of scale pretty easily, especially when they go to a new generation of atomic weapons. But Rabi, who was one of the physicists involved, witnessed the explosion. He said they were the longest 10 seconds of his life. Suddenly there was an enormous flash of light, the brightest light I had ever seen, or that I think anyone has ever seen. It blasted, it pounced, it bored its way right through you. It was a vision which was seen with more than the eye. It was seen to last forever. You would wish it would stop. Altogether, it lasted about 2 seconds. Finally, it was over, diminishing, and we looked toward the place where the bomb had been. There was an enormous ball of fire, which grew, and it rolled as it grew. It went up in the air in yellow flashes and into scarlet and green. It looked menacing. It seemed to come toward us. A new thing had just been born, a new control, a new understanding of man, which man had just acquired over nature. And again, there's definitely this sense that now there is something new, and that this was a new age, an atomic age. As they were making it, they sort of anticipated this was going to happen. And I think it definitely was. That's not to say it was a complete break from the past, but here are some of the heads of the Manhattan Project looking at what's left of the Trinity test. That's Groves in the uniform in the middle, and there he is, and there's Robert Oppenheimer. You can see they've all got protective booties on because there might be some radiation. This pin here is a radiation detector. Atomic bombs do generate radioactive fallout, but it's not nearly to the level that it would be for the next generation of nuclear weapons. Less than a month later, the bomb is used on Japan. First on Hiroshima at 8:16 in the morning. No clouds, no wind, 80% humidity, and people walking and bicycling to work, streetcars packed, soldiers exercising, schoolgirls cleaning the streets in case of attack. And an air raid siren alerted the people to the approach of the Enola Gay, but there were only 3 planes, and so as you probably know, no one really worried too much. And then the bomb exploded about 2,000 feet above Shima Hospital, missing the aiming point of Aoi Bridge by just 500 feet. The bomb that exploded over Hiroshima was a smaller yield than the test bomb at Trinity. That wasn't by design, but it was just not a complete explosion. Still 12,500 tons of TNT equivalent, burning 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit at ground zero. There were 76,000 buildings in Hiroshima at that time. 70,000 of them were destroyed instantly. 18 emergency hospitals, 32 emergency clinics were destroyed, and 90% of all medical personnel. So the death toll was pretty high, 75,000 instantly, 140,000 by the end of 1945. Because radiation is absorbed into tissue, it kills more slowly, and by 1950 there was an estimate of 200,000 people dead, a 50% fatality rate. Some people compare it to the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed about 100,000 out of 1 million people. So that's a fatality rate of 10%. So this one bomb can kill half of the city's population. And so it was a change, right? A lot of people like to say, well, you can. If you look at pictures of the Civil War, you could destroy a city, right? It was possible, but with the sort of less effort of atomic weapons, it certainly changed things for everyone. August 9, the bomb is used on Nagasaki. That bomb exploded at 11:02 a.m., 1,600 feet above the ground, 22 kilotons. So a much more powerful bomb, but it actually killed fewer people because of the geography of Nagasaki. 40,000 dead instantly, 70,000 dead by the end of 1945, and 140,000 is the estimate of over time. If you wanted to, you could maybe make an estimate that people are still to some extent dying. These radioactivity causes birth defects, and they can get passed on. But the point is that so many of us are affected by the atomic bomb, and of course there's different categories: people who survived it, who witnessed it. But I think anyone who sort of lived through the nuclear era has. I don't want to compare my plight to victims. But you know, I was traumatized by it to some extent, or the fear of it, as I mentioned at the beginning. That's not to say it's anything comparable, but it is to say that we have all had this weapon sort of in our thoughts, and I think that has to affect us in some way. Now, Truman, after the second bomb, ordered a halt to atomic bombings. They had a third bomb in pieces that was probably could have been ready to go pretty quickly. And on August 15, Japan began the surrender process. We can talk. A lot of people like to talk about, you know, the role of the bomb in ending the war. Whether the use of the bomb was ethical and moral and all that. We can certainly talk about it. Historians argue about it all the time and love to argue about it. The role of the Red Army matters. So let me know if you want to, if you have questions or comments on that topic. It's a deep one, and one that I think will never get totally, I don't think people will get tired of discussing it. But some of this will come up as I look at the evolution of the bomb's life as it gets older and older. I will say that either way, you know, historians argue that the bomb, that Japan probably could have surrendered without the bomb, without using the bomb. Others say there's no chance. Either way, there's been, I think there's some moral sort of question about whether, you know, underneath this question is, was it right to use the bomb? And I think men and women of goodwill can have different takes on this question, but either way, there's definitely been a taboo on its use since then. Pretty much almost every president has said, you know, ideally there would be no nuclear weapons. People around the world, and we'll see that Nobel Prizes go out to people who try and eliminate nuclear weapons. So there's some sort of agreement that whatever happened in World War II, using them again would be to some degree unacceptable. Now, whether that's because there's this taboo on it or because, you know, people just don't want to get annihilated in retaliation is certainly a question we can discuss as well. But Oppenheimer, when he was finished with the Manhattan Project, described nuclear weapons as both a peril and a hope. A peril, obviously, because the ability to build them was not limited to the United States, and they could be used against the United States, but also a hope because they promised two things. One thing is, of course, nuclear energy, which at the time was seen as maybe a clean alternative, something that could alleviate dependence on fossil fuels and whatnot, but also a hope then, and a lot of Manhattan Project scientists felt this way, that the results of Nagasaki and Hiroshima would be so sobering to people that they would not want to ever make war again, because war would inevitably become nuclear. Now, we know that didn't happen, but that was certainly a mindset at the time, that maybe, and I think it was a genuine mindset that, you know, yes, this had to be done, but maybe it will teach a lesson to future generations. What I want to do now is look at the bomb at 80 years old. So I want to go through each decade of its life in, you know, a bit of a fast forward, but to highlight some of the issues that the American people have sort of expressed about nuclear weapons and what have you. Of course, so its 10th birthday occurred in 1955. So between 1946 and 1955, there was, of course, a tremendous amount of evolution in nuclear weapons. And I've just put a date up for these photos. I hope you can see it, just to give you a sense of well, we'll see how things change and what happens. By 1946, at first, interestingly, the very first reactions to the atomic bomb were a bit trepidatious, a bit amount of fear. By the time Japan surrendered, the American public became more comfortable with the idea of the atomic bomb. But when it wasn't clear that it had that the war had ended, there was some hesitation. And this kind of unease goes away after the war ends, but then it starts to come back a little bit over time. At any rate, it was certainly something that everyone had heard of. By 1946, one poll that was done found that 98% of adults knew what the atomic bomb was. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that 98% of the country would have heard of. You know, I mean, there's some exceptions, but that's a pretty It's a pretty big number. In September of 1945, a Gallup poll found 69% of respondents said that the atomic bomb was a good thing, quote. 17% decided it was a bad thing, and 14% had no opinion. Those numbers start to creep up in the years after World War II. By 1946, in response to the question, how worried are you about the atomic bomb? 25% of respondents were greatly worried. 65% were not worried. So the numbers are still lean to the side of not worried, but these numbers are going up, right? Because 17% said it was a bad thing earlier, now 25% seem to be worried about it. 80% of respondents in 1946 thought that other nations already had the ability to make atomic bombs, which was not the case. Almost half of respondents said that another world war would be likely in 25 years, and 64% saw a real danger that atomic bombs would be used against the United States. One person who was interviewed for a study said, I know the bomb can wipe out cities, but I let the government worry about it. So again, I don't mean to indicate that most people were concerned, but that the numbers are rising. By 1947, only 55% of respondents considered the atomic bomb a good thing, and 38% considered it a bad thing. So there is ambivalence. Now, what do we make of these polls? I guess one thing I found when I was studying was that I was surprised at to this extent of an ambivalence about the weapon. I thought for sure Americans would celebrate it right away as the winning weapon, and that happened. But as Americans are, maybe all humans, the focus turned to the future and what the future held for warfare and geopolitics. I want to talk too. I want to over this talk remind you of the American public's view of the weapon in terms of popular culture. One thing we see is this ambivalence about nuclear weapons expressed in songs. Country music was the first genre to really take on the atomic bomb, and it usually had was used as sort of a metaphor or in comparison with God's might. There was a song by Fred Kirby, a country musician, Fred Kirby, called Atomic Power. That was a relatively big hit for the time. And the point of this song was that the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were actually not a big deal compared to the power of a vengeful God. A line from the song says, "We will not know the minute and we will not know the hour. Are you ready for that great atomic power?" And so sort of comparing it to Armageddon, but not wanting to say that it was more powerful than Armageddon or God. Public opinion really changes about the atomic bomb in 1947 with the publication of John Hersey's short book, Hiroshima, originally published in The New Yorker. And this was the first book to cover the aftermath of the bomb, the first effort that wasn't censored. The government censored photography and other things in 1946 and 47. And the book is ostensibly completely apolitical. It just follows the story of some of the victims. I can keep going with these pictures. This is, of course, at the Bikini Atoll, where they put a bunch of old battleships and such in the ocean and destroyers and such, and just sort of see, well, what happens? It's like, well, they blow up, you know. The book Hiroshima, it just follows the story of some survivors in Japan, and it's very moving, but it's completely leaves out any sort of context for the decision. You know, Truman isn't mentioned. World War II is hardly mentioned in the book. And so it was sobering, I think, for a lot of Americans to just see the effects of the bomb not sort of explained as sort of a geopolitical decision or part of strategy or something like that. As time has gone on, we've learned a bit about the book follows a certain. It's clear he found the survivors through certain church groups, and some of the survivors that he looks at, one of them is even German. You know, they aren't necessarily totally representative samples of the public, but when he wrote about who he could, I guess, and who he knew. So it was it was sobering. But as I said, over time, people like to bring in more context and look at the decision in the context of World War II and so on. I thought I had a, might be later. Oh yeah, because I'm going in order. 1949 is pretty soon after the Soviet atomic bomb. The Soviet Union creates an atomic bomb. This is a picture from the 1990s. The Soviets weren't so forthcoming with sharing photos of their atomic weapons, at least when they tested them. But in Kazakhstan, the Soviet atomic bomb was built. They tested some of them in Siberia, but then usually mostly in Kazakhstan. So August 29, 1949, it's just 4 years, almost exactly 4 years after the United States uses its atomic bombs, the Soviet Union has one. One witness to the Soviet explosion said that the white fireball engulfed the tower. Expanding rapidly, changing color, it rushed upwards. The blast wave at the base, sweeping in its path structures, stone houses, machines. It rolled like a billow from the center, mixing up stones, logs of wood, pieces of metal, and dust into one chaotic mass. It should sound like Robbie's reaction earlier to the American bomb. The fireball, rising and revolving, turned orange, red, then dark streaks appeared. Streams of dust, fragments of brick and board were drawn in after it, as into a funnel. Overtaking the firestorm, the shock wave, hitting the upper layers of the atmosphere, passed through several layers of inversion. There, as in a cloud chamber, the condensation of water vapor began. A strong wind weakened the sound, and it reached us like the roar of an avalanche. This is Kazakhstan, where they tested most of their nuclear weapons. According to one historian, the head of the security head of the Soviet atomic bomb project, Lavrentiy Beria, when it exploded, he hugged the head scientist of the Soviet bomb project, Igor Kurchatov, and the first thing he shouted was, "Did it look like the American one?" And this is because they were trying to mimic the American one exactly, and he felt that if it didn't look exactly like the U.S. one, Joseph Stalin was going to punish him, which may have been pretty accurate, actually. The United States referred to the Soviet bomb as Joe 1. The Soviets called it the first lightning bomb. It exploded at about 20 kilotons and was pretty similar to the American one when all things are considered. All right, 1950, atomic spies arrested in the United States. This is Klaus Fuchs. He was not an American, but he was German and then British and had supplied the Soviet Union with a lot of information from Los Alamos, a lot of it useful. And so again, that was one reason why Beria was wondering if the bomb would look like the American one. And then later in 1950, they catch actual American citizens who had been atomic spies. This is David Greenglass. He was a low-level engineer. His information that he gave to the Soviet Union wasn't particularly useful. It wasn't particularly good. He didn't quite understand the overall concepts. But after all, he was trying to give the Soviet Union the secret. To avoid a painful sentence, he supplied information on his brother-in-law and sister, Julius and Ethel, you see right there. Julius had run a spy ring during the war, and to get a lighter sentence, David Greenglass told the FBI all they wanted to know about him, and in fact, he made up a good amount of information too to enhance his sentence reduction. They were both killed in 1953, executed. Ethel, it's pretty clear, probably wasn't involved in the spy ring. Greenglass only said she typed up notes for it when the FBI asked him, for like the fourth or fifth time, do you have anything we can use as leverage against them? And later in 2008, he actually admitted that he made that up about her. So a brother sending his sister to the electric chair. This is the Red Scare, right? This is the Cold War and what people were sort of reduced to. Julius Rosenberg, there's no question he was guilty of spying. Ethel Rosenberg might have known, but she didn't take part. I don't know what the punishment is for knowing and not taking part. But back to pop culture, 1951. This is the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. Some of you maybe remember. And like a lot of these nuclear movies, it doesn't actually mention nuclear weapons, but Klaatu, the alien, has this weapon this sort of robot-looking weapon that can destroy anything. So it's clearly a nuclear weapon. And at the end of the movie, he leaves them on Earth to see if humans can get along. The point is that in these movies and films and everything, people wondered, will humans be able to avoid blowing themselves up? That was one theme you see in pop culture. It's an open question, but people take it very seriously. Will they destroy themselves? A mainstream fear of nuclear weapons. Because the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb in 1950, Harry Truman approves a crash program for a thermonuclear weapon. And if anyone wants to know how these weapons work, I'm happy to tell you, but there's some science involved. But the point is that the thermonuclear weapon is just a much more massive nuclear weapon. Instead of splitting an atom, it fuses atoms together, and in doing so releases a tremendous amount of energy. To give you a sense of scale, an atomic bomb is actually used as a match to light a thermonuclear explosion, right? That's how puny a nuclear weapon, an atomic weapon is to a nuclear weapon. And the United States felt compelled to build this weapon because not only the Soviet atomic bomb, but China, the civil war in China ends in 1949 with communists led by Mao Zedong taking over. So it feels, that these communists are going to try and take over the world. They would have liked to if you had let them. Turns out, though, China and Soviet Union just hated each other's guts, and they never really quite got along. In the late 60s, early 70s, they started shooting at each other even. But there was, this sort of reasonable assumption. Something like a fifth of the world was now under communism after China and the Soviet Union were both communist, and this was seen as a precaution that the United States had to take. And you can't even get a sense of scale from it. I mean, these are almost like abstract works of art. These are pictures taken of early atomic tests in the South Pacific, and you can't, you're miles away. I mean, you can't even see the ground or anything like that. Atomic weapons were measured in kilotons, right? 1,000 tons of TNT, and atomic bombs are measured in megatons, right? Millions of tons of TNT. So it's an exponential increase in weaponry. One witness to the first U.S. thermonuclear test simply said, "You would swear that the whole world was on fire." And the United States has its atomic bomb, a weaponized thermonuclear bomb, ready in 1954. The Soviet Union not far behind in 1955, they have theirs. The single thermonuclear bomb would have obliterated all the boroughs of New York, right? It's just tremendous in size. For a 20 kiloton atomic bomb, like say the Nagasaki bomb, anyone within a mile and a half of ground zero would receive third-degree burns, probably fatal. For a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb, it's anyone within 7 miles of ground zero is pretty much burned to death. First-degree burns from a thermonuclear weapon, people more than 10 miles away can still receive first-degree burns. The blast winds measured at the detonation are equivalent to the fastest typhoons. And of course, they release new forms of radioactivity. The test, as I said, on November 1st, 1952, the United States tests a device. They can explode it, but it was the size of a building. It wasn't a deliverable weapon. That comes, as I said, in 1954. And here's some images from those. Around this time, Great Britain also makes its first atomic bomb, not necessarily because they felt threatened, but because they felt that as a great power, they had to have one. They were part of NATO, and the United States was obligated to protect Britain with its nuclear weapons, but Britain wants one, to feel important. That came in October 1952. As I said, the Soviet thermonuclear weapon or hydrogen bomb, they achieved that November 23rd, 1955. It was only a few megatons, but it was a more of an original device than their atomic bomb had been. They received much less data from spies on the thermonuclear weapon, although Klaus Fuchs had given them some. 1954, also the year, the screen debut of a giant monster called Godzilla. This was a Japanese film, and in this film they're very upfront that Godzilla has been released from too many H-bomb tests. They've sort of shattered the ground and he emerges out of it and he just stomps all over Tokyo, right? And this is a very obvious metaphor that these thermonuclear weapons, right, and they're just destroying Japan. And Japan feels sort of that they're going to be victims of this again, maybe by accident this time, maybe not on purpose. But again, you see in pop culture this taking the bomb seriously. I mean, Godzilla, if you watch the movie now, it's, you know, part of it's comic, but at the time they were, this reflected a genuine fear of atomic weapons. And the popularity of these types of films in the United States, at least to some extent, reflects, I think, some sharing of those fears. So that was by the time the bomb was 10 years old. 1965, it's 20 years old. I guess it's got its driver's license by that point, I don't know. But the bomb continued to proliferate. France, you know, I have pictures of the France bomb. Let me just tell you about pop culture first. In this theme of taking the bomb seriously, by the time the bomb's, you know, reaching its teenage years, there are some now who are not taking the bomb quite as seriously. And in pop culture, you see jokes about the bomb. This is Wanda Jackson, a rockabilly star, and she had a minor hit with a song called Fujiyama Mama, in which she uses the atomic bomb as a sexual metaphor. She sings, I've been to Nagasaki, Hiroshima too, the same I did to them, baby, I can do to you, right? Because I'm a Fujiyama Mama, about to blow my top. So obviously this is not a song about fearing the atomic bomb or anything like that. And apparently, even I've looked in the history of the song, it was a hit in Japan, right? They liked it, right? So it's hard to know what to make of pop culture, right? But maybe people are becoming more comfortable with the atomic bomb. It's hard to say, but it's a fantastic song also, by the way. Wanda turned to gospel music later in her life. This is an atomic test, the hardtack test in 1958. But you also see the evolution of missiles and the obvious addition. It's not even much of an equation, right? Missile plus atomic bomb equals nuclear missile, right? Or a thermonuclear warhead. And they start to work on that in the 1960s. France achieves the bomb in 1960. So after the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain, France is the fourth country to achieve nuclear weapons. And Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France, certainly he had visions of French greatness too, but France never sort of felt the United States was as close a NATO ally as it could be. And so he wanted France to have its own force, its own nuclear forces, so that they wouldn't have to depend on the United States during the Cold War. They achieved that in 1960 with a 70 kiloton plus plutonium bomb. That's pretty big. And they developed their own thermonuclear weapon in 1968. In China, China started working on its bomb, and their bomb, they called it the People's Bomb with some reason, because they forced peasants to hunt for uranium all over the country. They gathered 150 tons of uranium through this forced labor, and they developed an implosion uranium bomb. Usually you would use implosion with plutonium, but they used it with uranium for some reason. But it was successful October 1964. Then they had a thermonuclear weapon by 1967. And by the year 2000, they had 450 warheads. China is, even today, probably still the most active in building nuclear weapons. There's others too, but China probably is the most active development program. As I mentioned, missiles because of the Soviet launch of Sputnik, right, the first artificial satellite. 1957, they launched the satellite, and the whole point is to show their impressive rocketry, and that if you have a nuclear warhead on a rocket and you just tilt it a little, it becomes a missile rather than a sort of spacecraft, right? And missiles can be fired from anywhere. Before this, bombs had been, dropped by airplane. and they have a limited range, and more it becomes even easier to launch a nuclear weapon with the advent of missiles. I mentioned Fujiyama Mama by Wanda Jackson, but the seriousness of nuclear weapons was still shared by some. 1959, the movie On the Beach, which is about how nuclear war wipes out most of humanity. The survivors have to run to Australia or sail to Australia to try and hopefully avoid the radioactive cloud. And so again, you see this mix of one woman's country song, as a sexual metaphor, nuclear weapons, and then another very popular movie expressing a sort of earnest fear of these weapons. So mixed. It's still this ambivalence that was there from the earliest days of the atomic bomb. I don't know if anyone remembers the Twilight Zone episode called The Shelter, where one man built a fallout shelter in his yard and had to face the decision of whether he would allow the neighbors to come in who hadn't, sort of a sky is falling situation. And he doesn't, but then it turns out to be a false alarm, and he's got to live among his neighbors. So these very serious popular culture investigations of what people would do in nuclear war. At the same time, in 1964, you have Dr. Strangelove, a comedy about nuclear weapons, which is undeniably a funny film, a little dark, but one theory being, well, if we don't laugh about this nuclear threat, it'll be all we can think about. And so that's the sort of, otherwise we'll cry, is kind of the mindset behind this. Early 60s as well, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The CIA spy planes discover evidence of Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. The Kennedy Library has a very impressive film about it now. And what we now know is that some of the missiles were ready to go, and there were small atomic-sized nuclear weapons that Soviet soldiers were authorized to use if they faced an invasion from the United States, not known at the time. So the idea of invading Cuba, had Kennedy authorized it, would have been a huge disaster. As it was, we narrowly avoided nuclear war. Also present at the Cuban Missile Crisis were 2 Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes. They had been ordered to use them if they were fired upon, which indeed they were by anti-submarine airplanes. And one captain ordered the nuclear torpedo fired, but he was overruled by another captain. For some reason, this submarine had 2 captains on it, I guess thankfully, but continually coming very close to nuclear war. And so these nuclear scares constantly jar the American public into, I think, this sort of ambivalence about nuclear weapons. See here, this is the Nobel Prize winning chemist Linus Pauling protesting nuclear weapons around the same time, 1962, 63. You saw the rise of anti-nuclear groups now, right? These people uneasy about it. But what they're talking here is, the missiles are one thing, but he's saying we have no right to test. The testing of nuclear weapons, such as in these slides that I showed a little earlier, they had moved to Nevada because in the South Pacific it was getting a little too difficult, and you had sort of sovereign peoples that had to be moved around. In Nevada, they would test these weapons, but nuclear fallout would often spread, and it was theorized that this nuclear fallout caused a lot of cancers. Linus Pauling was heavily involved. He was a chemist, so he understood chemistry of the problem of chemistry. And just as one example, reporters would call him and ask him about nuclear fallout. Once in 1956, a reporter from Tonopah, Nevada called him about 7-year-old boy named Martin Bordoli. According to the reporter, Martin Bordoli in Twin Springs, Nevada lived under clouds of radioactive fallout downwind from the testing site, and residents of his town developed sore eyes. Examined by Atomic Energy Commission doctors who said there was nothing to worry about, the Bordoli family had been troubled by these sore eyes, and in spring of 1956, Martin developed leukemia, passed away on October 24. And Pauling, of course, was like, well, I think there's definitely some connection. It's hard to prove connection when it's cancer because people living in the same place obviously can have very different reactions. But you see, this became the sort of concern. Women's Strike for Peace was a group of activist women who portray themselves as sort of mothers concerned about children, right? And so the testing campaign became a sort of crusade to protect children from nuclear fallout. And this was this was actually, it's also inspired in Britain, where anti-nuclear groups started to protest nuclear weapons. Again, just reflecting this kind of ambivalence about the bomb, right? Linus Pauling won the Nobel Peace Prize for his anti-nuclear activism. So again, to show that there's this sort of, the different structures in society are sort of rewarding the idea that nuclear weapons are a danger to humanity. In 1963, President Kennedy endorsed that view to a good extent. He gives this amazing speech after the Cuban Missile Crisis about how everyone shares the same air, everyone has the same hopes, this sort of speech that reached out to the Soviet Union. In 1963, Kennedy signs the Limited Test Ban Treaty that bans nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere. So fallout becomes much less of a problem. That said, it did not actually limit nuclear tests. Nuclear testing increased after this test ban treaty. They just moved them underground, where you can, somebody figured out you can dig a big hole and test them underground, which is what happened. Let's see, this is a British, the slides are in chronological order. This is a British thermonuclear weapon. They didn't end up ultimately using the Blue Streak missile, which eventually was not, they didn't move it permanently into their arsenal, but they tested a lot. Here's scenes from China's first atomic test, again in 1964. The Soviet Union had initially helped China with its bomb, but pretty quickly withdrew its science advisors because of some spat over whatever these leftist countries argue about. But again, the back and forth between fear and ease over the bomb. This is Barry Maguire, a folk singer, who in 1965 had a hit with "Eve of Destruction," which was, he mentions a lot of things. He mentions civil rights, he mentions Red China at one point, but the whole idea of an eve of destruction seemed to talk about an atomic bomb or a nuclear weapon, and it hit #1. And again, what do you make of that? That's not to say that everybody agreed with it, but that certainly it was a popular sentiment at the time, and you can see the sort of rise of the hippie movement. This, I think, is taken a little later, I think 67 probably, with those pants that are just kind of amazing. He's also sort of wearing Grimace, that he's wearing like a Muppet on that sweater. It's just amazing. These are Soviet weapons in 1967. Of course, the Soviet Union liked to parade their weapons around Red Square and show off their nuclear might. They were sort of obsessed with catching up with the United States at this time. But so during the second decade of atomic weapons, it's again the same story of ambivalence, of concern, of new leaps in nuclear weapons, but also attempts to restrain them. Those attempts to restrain them not usually terribly successful. Even though, again, every president, right, starting with Eisenhower, they start to say, we shouldn't. Eisenhower enters office, and a lot of presidents, right, it's Kennedy too, really pro-nuclear and saying, we're going to modernize our arsenals, we're going to rely heavily on nuclear weapons. By the end of their terms, they're signing test bans, or they're talking about how nuclear weapons are not the way to go, right? And this pattern just is there, and it seems to stem, from sobering moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy was the only one of this executive committee that didn't want to invade Cuba, which, as we know now, would have resulted in a nuclear retaliation. So they get sort of alarmed by this massive power. It doesn't stem them from waging foreign policy or waging war, but there seems to be something different to them about nuclear weapons. By 1975, the bomb turns 30. The 10 years since its 20th birthday saw again proliferation. Now to the country of Israel, which had been thinking about nuclear weapons since the 1940s. These are just some more nuclear missiles from the 1960s. The French would test their nuclear weapons in like the most fragile environment. I mean, they tested nuclear weapons by the Great Barrier Reef. You know, they just, and then also in the Sahara Desert, they have these, I mean, it's almost become sort of abstract art, as I said. These are French tests. This one from 1970. So Israel had been working on nuclear weapons since the late 1940s, getting help from Britain, getting help from France. Kennedy wanted them not to have a nuclear program, to sort of feel protected by the United States and not to antagonize their Middle Eastern neighbors. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel felt compelled to go further with their nuclear program. We don't know when exactly Israel developed its nuclear weapons, but by 1970, in 1970, a New York Times reporter revealed the existence of its nuclear weapons. This is the Dimona facility in Israel where they build their nuclear weapons. Also, in the 1970s, 1974, the nation of India develops or at least conducts a nuclear explosion. Now it was a very small explosion, 4 to 6 kilotons, which is, I mean, a lot by itself, but for a nuclear weapon that's very small. And when it was detected, they said this was, right, they're the nation of Gandhi, how can they have nuclear weapons? They said this was a peaceful atomic explosion meant to see if they could build nuclear reactors. And the world kind of doesn't know how to respond to that. In 1968, many of the world powers had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, vowing that they would not help other countries build nuclear weapons. India did not sign that, and has yet to sign it. But they promised that this was not to build weapons, that it was to work on nuclear power. And there's some evidence that, yeah, I guess there are other ways, though, to test whether you can do that without building explosions. You can just build a reactor. So there was some skepticism about this decision. As I mentioned, in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the countries that sign it, who have nuclear weapons, vow that they will not help other countries attain nuclear weapons. The countries who signed it that don't have nuclear weapons promise not to build nuclear weapons. But the trade-off is, we will not build nuclear weapons, these countries say, but the treaty requires the nuclear countries to help us create nuclear power and build nuclear power plants. And of course, you can use nuclear power plants to enrich uranium that can be used to build nuclear weapons. So this is a sort of sticky situation for these countries. Does a country that wants nuclear energy, does it secretly want to build nuclear weapons? Certainly that was a question surrounding India in the 1970s. Speaking of proliferation, anti-nuclear activists like to point out that they succeeded to some extent in limiting the countries that had nuclear weapons. Right? There's such a taboo on it that only 10 countries have ever had nuclear weapons. On the other hand, you can say, well, 10 countries have it. That's a lot. Well, it's 9 now, but 10 countries have had it. There were a few countries that were likely to have it: Brazil, Sweden, who have not developed nuclear weapons. So there is, to some degree, that's seen as a success for the anti-nuclear movement, but also, maybe not. I mean, it's hard to tell what would have happened if they hadn't protested. Most countries have decided whether to build nukes or not for very strategic reasons, and so. 10 countries, is it a lot to have nuclear weapons, or is it not a lot? That's something I think that most people have to decide for themselves. 1972, more nuclear weapons treaties, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty coming out of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in 1972. But this was giving up a weapon system that the United States didn't see a lot of use in, anti-ballistic missiles. And it's largely seen that was a détente agreement with the Soviet Union, a sort of way of showing that the superpowers are going to get along for a while. It's not that they love each other, it's not that they want to disarm or anything, but that they showed they could reach an agreement on some kind of nuclear weapon, and that would allow each country to sort of not worry so much about the other side for a while, and the United States could kind of recover from after the Vietnam War, and the Soviet Union could work on, the plan was to to develop a further stage of socialism. They didn't quite get there, but so you have these treaties that are more symbolic, I think, than anything about nuclear weapons. It is during the 1970s when the Soviet Union does catch up and surpass the United States when it comes to nuclear weapons. This is a cruise missile from the time. We're getting into the 1980s here. These are U.S. nuclear cruise missiles. But the Soviet Union catches up to the United States in missiles. This was a big thing to Cold War leaders, as you probably know, that who's got more missiles. The Soviet Union, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, goes on this crash building of missiles, and they outnumber U.S. missiles by the 1970s. However, the United States at that point had gone for a more, we'll have fewer missiles, but they'll be more accurate. Whereas the Soviet missiles were less accurate, but they could just fire so many at you that eventually they figured that you'd get hit by them. To think about some of the numbers by the 1980s, submarines were armed with nuclear missiles, and they could have multiple warheads on each missile. A submarine could hold about 16 missiles. Each missile could have 10 warheads on it, so that's 160 warheads on a single submarine. The Soviet Union only had 50 cities, so you could destroy each Soviet Union city 3 times with one submarine. And then this was the arms race, right? You just build up more and more and more. As I said, the presidents always start to kind of realize, well, what can you do with that many nuclear weapons? Maybe we should limit them. And pretty much, again, every president leaves office with the kind of somewhat reconsideration of how many quite would be enough. 1985, the atomic bomb turns 40. In the years since, in 1976 to 1985, South Africa had become the latest nuclear country. South Africa had developed 6 atomic weapons by 1977, getting help from France, West Germany, and Israel. They had a lot of uranium in South Africa. South Africa, an apartheid state. In fact, the leaders of South Africa developed their atomic bomb not for external enemies, but because of fear of a black uprising. And when South Africa, when the apartheid regime ended and the African National Congress took over, South Africa also dismantled its nuclear weapons program. And so it is the first state to actually do so, to give up nuclear weapons, although, again, we can question their motives, not necessarily totally altruistic motives, but a question of different regimes not wanting to leave them for the next regime. Again, more fears. The 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster in 1979, a partial meltdown there. I remember my grandmother lived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at that time, and she kept calling my father, should I leave? What should I do? But the best was the T-shirts that people sold. It said, "I survived 3 Mile Island," but it had 3 sleeve holes, which I thought was pretty good joke. Pretty intense concern about nuclear weapons. 1982, the largest demonstration in U.S. history happens in New York. 750,000 people march in New York in Central Park against nuclear weapons. And again, just that it was a huge movement. But I think a lot of textbooks sort of forget about this because they ultimately weren't all that successful in any nuclear weapons. Here we have, these are some letters I found, probably from some school in, Cambridge. But they, I remember living through this age. This is the age when I asked my mother, my questions. Just letters to Reagan about nuclear weapons, right? And, you would have TV shows and all these sorts of movies. The public seems... in the 1980s, more and more concerned about nuclear weapons. I hope you and the Russians stop making war. It was 1983 was the first year where there weren't nuclear weapons disarmament talks between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Of course, as Reagan quipped to his credit, the Soviet leaders kept dying on him, so it was hard to get negotiations going. 1983 is known as the Year of the Missile. The United States deployed new intermediate-range missiles to Europe, as did the Soviet Union. And it seemed as though things were taking a big step backward since Nixon and Brezhnev had signed the anti-ballistic missile treaty. To some extent that's a mistake because the treaties were kind of symbolic and neither side had stopped making nuclear weapons. Carter, in fact, had ordered the deployment of these intermediate missiles to Europe, but he was out of office and Reagan approved the move. And so some of this was just in a long tradition of nuclear buildups. It wasn't necessarily the severe break that it was seen as, but nevertheless, it seemed alarming. It seemed alarming especially to Europe. This, I think, is a French tank armed with a nuclear missile. This is in Britain. The Europeans were seeing themselves as we're going to be the site of a nuclear war, and we don't want to be, so you have a tremendous amount of opposition here. And Reagan faced a real dilemma in his first term about nuclear weapons. It did seem the public saw them as pretty unpopular, and he has to run for re-election, and he has some fear that it might affect his candidacy in 1984. So he announces, right, this is when he starts to talk about, he has his reconsideration that nuclear war should never be fought. Earlier in his term, he was making jokes about it and talking about how the Soviet Union would be destroyed. He reconsiders and he comes up with the Strategic Defense Initiative, which you probably remember, the idea that satellites in space would shoot missiles out of the sky. At one point, they might be nuclear-powered lasers, but then they went with X-rays. And it's not easy to shoot a missile out of the sky, especially if you don't know when it's launched and where it's going. But this was, a lot of people disliked this, a lot of those protesters that we looked at, but also this was his vision of we will have a shield, not a sword, is how they talked about it at the time. A defense against nuclear weapons. It was his effort to appear less aggressive in nuclear weapons, and the science behind it never quite worked, but the Soviet Union certainly thought it was real and that it would work, and they worried, and it encouraged them to also approach Reagan about nuclear disarmament talks, which eventually made some headway. 1983, the TV movie The Day After was aired. Something like 30 million people watched it. I mean, it was like that would never happen today, that so many people watching the same show at the same time. The Day After showed the effects of a nuclear war in Kansas and in other places, and all the reports were that it was terrifying to a lot of people. And this was some of the pressure that was put on Reagan. The White House actually made an active campaign to criticize the movie, or to have people sort of write editorials about how the movie wasn't necessarily accurate. But Reagan pivots, and after his second term begins, he is talking much less about nuclear war and more about how to stop it. He meets with Gorbachev, as you know. He is wants to, he has these speeches that people love about farmers in the United States and a Moscow couple, Ivan and Svetlana, or somebody like that, and he just tries to put himself in the Soviet shoes. And again, like most presidents, by the end of his term is signing treaties to ban certain types of nuclear weapons by the end of the Cold War. Popular culture still very much anti-nuclear in the 1980s. This is the German group Nena, right? 99 Luftballons, which we've all heard. That was an anti-nuclear song, and it hit #2 on the American charts. Now, one thing you can say is, well, the public must have been against nuclear weapons. At the same time, hello, the song was in German, right? Did people know what it meant? What do we make of pop culture? If a song is anti-nuclear, what does it mean that it was popular? Now, they did release an English version a year later, but there were a good deal of Americans listening to this song, probably not knowing what it meant. Although there were videos, and this was MTV, so there was some knowledge. But pop and rock groups opposing war, not a terribly surprising development in pop culture. But if you look at music and movies in the 80s, nuclear weapons are just very prevalent. I just like this is a British protest, but the Mohawk there is just like prime 1980s. So being against nuclear weapons is like this sort of punk rock kind of thing. It's kind of, it's sort of youthful. It's not the baby boom generation who had the Vietnam War protests, but it's, a new generation that has something to sort of protest the idea of nuclear bombs. Here's the Soviets marching more of their bombs across Red Square. 1985, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War won the Nobel Peace Prize. So again, another anti-nuclear group. The Nobel Prize Committee seems to reward anti-nuclear groups pretty often. It's seen as, it's making it a legitimate, it's legitimizing it a respectable thing to do as their way of trying to prevent nuclear war, to put this taboo on it that should discourage leaders from using it. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the reason that they haven't been used, but we see this struggle in society of sort of the military and geopolitical necessity of deploying these weapons and deterring other countries, while publics often protest them as unnecessary. And I think because the Cold War ended without a nuclear war, the question was never really answered. It's easy to say these weapons weren't necessary because they weren't used. It's easy to say that they were because, we have no idea of what would have happened, right? Of what happened. By 1995, the atomic bomb turns 50. It's getting a bit old and creaky, especially nuclear power plants. 1986 is the Chernobyl disaster. The meltdown where radioactivity spread to Scandinavia, even to Ireland. But let's see, and we have some of the nuclear weapons here. But also 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Reduction Treaty, removing nuclear missiles from Europe, the first treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons that were actually already existing. One thing that historians argue is that after the Cold War ends in 91, that when the bomb appears in popular culture, it doesn't really mean as much. It's not a serious fear. That people after the Cold War aren't really afraid of nuclear weapons. If it's in a movie or a video game, it's because it looks cool, exploding, but that they're not. And I would question that. I teach students about the atomic bomb. Whether they're afraid of it or not is sort of an open question, how society feels. But undeniable, after the Cold War, many countries reduced their nuclear forces tremendously. These are some deactivation of nuclear missiles in Russia, or what was the Soviet Union. Of course, one concern when the Soviet Union broke apart was the Soviet Union had nuclear missiles in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, which became independent nations. And the world, especially anti-nuclear activists, felt that the missiles should be returned to Russia because that would mean, if they weren't, that would mean 3 new nuclear powers, and they might not have the security to protect those nuclear weapons. And then when Russia invades Ukraine in 2022, you wonder how wise it was to take the missiles out of Ukraine, but it's sort of too late for that. But it seemed like a good idea at the time to let the Soviet Union, to let Russia guard these nuclear weapons. Also in 1995, another Peace Prize for an anti-nuclear activist, a man named Joseph Rotblat, who had worked on the Manhattan Project. He had actually quit the Manhattan Project when he learned that Germany had surrendered, because that's why he had built the bomb, to deter Hitler and not use against Japan. These are just more scenes of Soviet nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. Also in 1995, the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian, where the Enola Gay was supposed to be put on display with historians providing the sort of latest interpretations of the use of the atomic bomb and their views at the time, which was their views at the time. It reflected that the bomb probably wasn't necessary for Japan to surrender, which puts a sort of negative moral spin on it. Since then, there's been more consideration of the Japanese side, and it seems like maybe Japan would not have surrendered without using the atomic bomb. Although, as I said, we'll still argue over it probably for a long time. By 2005, you have more nuclear proliferation when the bomb enters its 60th year. In years between 96 and 2005, Pakistan tests its first nuclear weapon in 2008. These are actually India's. India in 1998 officially declares itself a nuclear weapon state. So their peaceful nuclear test in the 70s turned out to be, yes, we were developing nuclear weapons after all. Their nuclear weapons are kind of ugly, if you ask me. Pakistan develops nuclear weapons also in 1988. Of course, these are sworn enemies, and you know there was a very tense standoff when these weapons when it became news that these weapons were developed. And you know, for all we know, they still might. Well, they still don't like each other at any rate. September 11, fears of terrorists attaining access to nuclear weapons was pretty prevalent around then. The Iraq War with claims of weapons of mass destruction. Middle East countries getting these weapons has been a long-term sort of problem for American foreign policy. But also in 2005, the International Atomic Energy Authority, again, wins the Nobel Prize, right? Every so often, the Nobel Prize Committee tries to reward people for opposing nuclear weapons, hoping it'll somehow have some sort of effect. Pop culture, remember, it goes back and forth between this concern for nuclear weapons and kind of not taking them too seriously. In 2005, an opera about atomic weapons debuted, Dr. Atomic. And in this is very serious. I mean, it's very dramatic because it's an opera, but very serious. The atomic bomb is this menace, and it's meant to be, so now we have a sort of return back to not only interest in the early days of atomic weapons, but in this sense that even though the Cold War's over, the problem of nuclear weapons hasn't gone anywhere. These are just more scenes. By 2015, another nuclear weapon state, North Korea, in 2006 gets their nuclear weapon. They have a few. They claim to have a thermonuclear bomb. It's not quite certain that they do. That in 2009, Nobel Prize Committee again gives the Nobel Prize to President Obama after he gives a speech in Prague where he says, we should probably get rid of nuclear weapons, and they give him the Peace Prize. And then he actually doesn't, as is usually the case. But again, we see this. There's this societal push to try and, reward world leaders for maybe getting rid of nuclear weapons. 2011, the Fukushima power plant disaster. The idea of nuclear power is it's not the same as a nuclear weapon, but it's certainly very destructive. And so the peril, remember the peril and the hope that nuclear energy could create a new form of energy not reliant on fossil fuels or not reliant on Middle Eastern states or whatever. The problem is these plants have disasters, and the disasters seem to outweigh the benefits of them. Finally, by the 80th birthday of the atomic bomb, the nuclear concerns largely in Ukraine, where the Zaporizhzhia power plant is in a war zone, and both sides are accusing the other of planning to sabotage this nuclear plant to poison the country with nuclear waste, but also more Nobel Prizes for anti-nuclear activists. In 2017, the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear War. In 2024, Nihon Hidankyo, a group for atomic bomb survivors, again wins the Nobel Peace Prize. In pop culture, we seen the Chernobyl miniseries, which maybe you saw, and then finally the Oppenheimer movie from 2023 was a tremendously popular film. And what's interesting to me is that we've seemed to come full circle, right? This movie, if you saw it, ends with Oppenheimer worrying that he's created a weapon that's going to destroy the world. And so the movie itself is about 1945, and the concerns that the movie expresses are about 1945, and it seems that if culture is any indication, we've come all the way back to the beginning and have started to maybe rethink the atomic era as a whole. What we will make of it in the future, I don't know, but probably some form of ambivalence. All right, well, that's all I wanted to talk about. If you have any questions or comments, I'd certainly like to address them now, but thank you for listening.
Are there any estimates regarding if they did not drop the bomb, either bomb in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, Are there any estimates of how many American lives or Allied lives that would have saved?
So it's a complex question. So they did not do estimates for for invading all of Japan and getting Japan to surrender. They did estimates for certain islands, and some of those were total guesses. Some of them were pretty reasonable. For the first island or two, what they would do is they would take Okinawa and they would say, well, it'll probably double that for certain islands. So there were estimates of 20,000 for the first month, 30,000, and tens of thousands for the first few months of the invasion. Now, if you extrapolate that out, it can get pretty high, but they didn't extrapolate that out. What happens later on is that when the book Hiroshima comes out, Harry Truman feels people are criticizing him too much about the bomb. And he has Stimson write this article, which in turn, the Secretary of War, he has a ghostwriter write, and they come up with these fantastic numbers, 500,000 and 1 million. And those, nobody said those at the time of the war. Again, they gave estimates for 30,000 here, 40,000 there, which added up. But nobody told Truman those big numbers. Now, you can imagine that it could be that high. But the thing is, and it's very clear that Stimson and Truman just pulled those estimates because they thought they would be effective in diffusing criticism. I don't know why he would think 30,000, 60,000, why that wouldn't, that's a good number too of lives saved. And Truman talked about that. He was kind of obsessed about this throughout his life in defending his decision. It wasn't like people were marching like they were in 1982. I don't know if he sort of overstated the opposite, but that was how he felt. Now, historians have looked at other ways to measure this, right? Those were the numbers from just an invasion. If they don't use the atomic bomb, what are they going to do? Are they going to blockade? Are they going to starve Japan to death? That might be even more. One thought that a historian has had now recently is that Japan was still an empire, and it was killing people far away from Japan every day, maybe 1,000 a day. And so if you get Japan to surrender, you save those lives too. Now, they weren't American, they weren't even Allied lives necessarily, although a lot of them were probably Chinese. But, so in that sense, you can get a tremendous number. And so which lives is it? There were just a lot of lives out there. And again, yeah, if they had to invade all of Japan, the number of lives would have gotten very high very quickly. So it's not to say that, it wouldn't have been 100,000 or however many 100,000, but they didn't have the estimate. And a lot of the early estimates were just MacArthur saying stuff. Later on, MacArthur says, we didn't even need to use the bomb. And anti-nuclear people have hooked on that. But I think that was MacArthur's bravado. I think that was, maybe they wouldn't have, but he wasn't, so involved in, they didn't invade Japan. So I wonder if a lot of that was, Eisenhower later said maybe we didn't need to use it. He was in Europe. He certainly knew stuff, and I wouldn't doubt his testimony. But a lot of the criticism of the decision to use the bomb is based on some of these comments by American military who I think, probably had other reasons for and whatever it was said in retrospect, not at the time. But so it's a long question. I can try to get more into it, but
I'm of the impression that we didn't want to drop the second bomb, but because of the Japanese resolve that they did, and because of their admiration for the emperor, that they were going to go to the last man.
Yeah, and there's some question of how much did the United States know about that. Japan had instructed one of its diplomats to approach the Soviet Union about a surrender back in July, before the war ended. But how serious was that approach? The diplomat said to his bosses, he said, well, what are we going to concede? Are we going to concede unconditional surrender? And they told, no, we just want them to stop, basically. So it wasn't necessarily the most serious proposal. What you do with that, I don't know. Do you say, well, okay, they're proposing something, maybe we should hear them out, But there was a lot of division within the Japanese government. Now, of course, Roosevelt, his policy during the war was to save as many American lives as possible while still winning. So Truman inherits that mindset. And so he thinks if any American lives can be saved, whatever the policy is, let's do it. So at first, the policy is get the Red Army to invade Japan because they don't know when the bomb's going to be ready. So at Yalta, then at Potsdam, Truman said, first Roosevelt, and then Truman says, all right, Stalin, will you fight the Japanese so you guys can do some of the dying, right? And then when they have the atomic bomb, Truman thinks, well, maybe we don't need them. But how do you tell your ally not to invade? How do you tell your ally you have an atomic bomb and you don't want to give it to him? Of course, Stalin knew because of the spies. So Truman hopes that the bomb can be used and Japan will surrender before the Soviet Union invades. Some scholars, especially in the 1960s when they were learning about this for the first time, they felt Truman, his first motivation was to deter the Soviets, and his second motivation was to end the war. And they say, well, if his real motivation was to end the war, he would have just allowed them to keep the emperor, which is what ended up happening. It seems now that Truman saw deterring the Soviets as kind of a secondary benefit, and that he thought this was the best way to end the war, the quickest way. But that deterring the Soviets was sort of, number 2 on his list, but still there. The Soviet Union invades anyway, right? Because they want to get in on the Japanese territory before Japan surrenders. They get about halfway down the Korean peninsula by August 8th. They declare, August 7th they declare war, 8th they invade Japanese territory in mainland China. And then on the 9th, the second atomic bomb. And some in the Japanese government, there's this one I can't remember the name, but one high-placed official said it's a deliverance. Now we can surrender with the excuse that the United States probably has a lot of these bombs rather than fighting to the end, because we're just gonna get annihilated. Other scholars have seen that the Soviet invasion was the big factor. After Hiroshima, the Japanese don't hold an emergency meeting. They're like, well, it's another city bombed. They've all been bombed. After the Red Army invades, they hold an emergency meeting. But they also hold one after Nagasaki because they realize the United States has more than one of these things. There's also an attempted coup in the Japanese government where they try and get the emperor to not surrender. That fails. But even when the emperor announces on August 10, and even on August 15, when he gives this recorded address to the people, he doesn't even use the word surrender. He says it's, the war is at a sad moment or something like that. So it does seem from the Japanese perspective that they were not ready to surrender until Nagasaki, and even to some extent after. But from the US perspective, it seems like the Truman administration knew that the Japanese had made some approaches about surrendering if they're allowed to keep their emperor. So if Truman knew that and bombed anyway, it's not a great look, but I think he just was he didn't know that they weren't totally serious efforts, but he ended up sort of being right about it, right? That this wasn't an avenue to pursue, and ultimately that's kind of the view that it did end the war. Some again dispute this entrance of the Red Army is so close to Nagasaki that it still provides a little bit of gray area. But thanks for the question. I know that's a very long answer, but I want to try and get it right because it's very.
As a follow-up to that, the war in Europe ended June 45. Bombs were dropped August 45. If the war in Europe had continued for another year, would Truman have dropped the bomb in Europe?
Roosevelt had always said that was the plan. That there was no dispute about that. That the bombs were made to be used on Germany as soon as possible. Now, I guess they would have bombed Berlin. There wasn't much left, but there was no question about that. And the people building the bomb had no compulsion. They felt Hitler, of course, that's why most of them had joined the project. A lot of them were refugees from Nazi Germany, and they were all too ready to use it up, against Germany. When Germany surrendered, it was almost this blind spot. They hadn't even thought about Japan. I'm talking about the people making the bomb, not the leaders, but you know, they were like, what are we going to do? And then Leslie Groves Instant is like, we're going to keep going because we got to use it against Japan. And most of them were like, oh yeah. But no, Roosevelt had actually, I think, made orders that it was going to be used against Germany as soon as it was ready, whereas there wasn't anything, he hadn't said anything about Japan, and that was sort of left to Truman and Stimson and all the others. But yeah, the whole fear was that Hitler had a bomb, and so they thought they were racing Nazi Germany for a bomb for most of the war.
Did he have a bomb? Did Hitler have a bomb?
No, so he should have. He had great scientists, even though all these scientists fled to the United States. They had Werner Heisenberg as head of the bomb project. And Hitler wasn't as excited about the bomb as you would think. He thought the war would be over before it was ready. And they had these V weapons, which were pretty impressive for the time. And so Hitler didn't put as much resources into it as he could have. But Germany would have had the uranium. They also went with heavy water instead of graphite as a moderator. We can talk about that. But the U.S. was able to, or the Allies were able to sabotage the heavy water supply. And they did, to some extent, thwart the atomic bomb program in Germany. However, Heisenberg was captured by the Allies. And unbeknownst to him, they stashed him in a farmhouse in Britain where they recorded his conversations with this fellow atomic scientist, and he didn't know he was being recorded. And it's amazing. You can read the transcripts. They hear the news on the radio about Nagasaki or Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they talk to each other. They say, do you think they really built it, or is this just fake? Did they really build it? And they're saying, well, and then they're saying, how are we going to explain the fact that we didn't build it? Because it's really embarrassing, because great scientists should have been able to build it. And they come up with this total lie, the German scientists, that, oh, we didn't build it on purpose. We slowed Hitler down, and we told him it couldn't be done, and we took our time doing things so that we wouldn't build one. And the American scientific community largely bought it, his excuse for the next sort of 10 years. But mainly, Hitler didn't support it, and the scientists didn't go enough into it in Germany. But so they weren't very close. They were closer than any other country besides the United States, but that wasn't very close. The United States scooped up a lot of uranium from Germany after emptying it out. Of course, so did the Soviet Union.